Well, this weekend, both in worship and in ABC, we are kicking off a short 3-week series, and the series is called Treasured. And I kind of want to give you the big idea of this series right out of the chute. The big idea of the series, Treasured, is that what we consider a treasure is that which is treasured by us. What we consider a treasure is that which is treasured by us. In other words, we make treasure by what we treasure. Because here's the deal, okay? The value that treasure has is not intrinsic as much as it is ascribed. The reason that we think certain things are valuable in this world is because we treat them like they are valuable. For example, take money. Everybody kind of thinks that is treasure, but it's just little green pieces of paper that have numbers on them. In and of themselves, they don't have any intrinsic value. However, they do have an ascribed value because they are backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, and they are legal tender for all debts, public and private. And so, because the government treasures them, we treasure them. Take, for instance, gold. You know, a lot of people over the years have decried the fact that we've gotten off the gold standard, and there have certainly been some economic changes that have taken place since then. But even when we were on the gold standard, how did we know that gold was valuable? Well, it was worth a lot of money. And how did we know that money was valuable? Well, it was worth a certain amount of gold. And so notice the circular valuation that's taking place here. Gold told money that it was valuable, and money told gold that it was valuable, but it was only valuable because we treated it like it was valuable. It was treasure because it was treasured by us. How about the difference between name brand items and generic items? Some of these items have the exact same ingredients, the exact same components. Others are so similar that for all intents and purposes, you can't tell a difference. And yet, name brand items generally cost more. Why? Because we've ascribed a certain amount of value to these name brands. They are more valuable because they are valued by customers. Even values themselves, morals. Look at all the polarization that we have going on in our country right now. I can't help but think that so many of these big fights are because people value different values. Some people value a certain set of values, other people value another set of values, and when these two sets of values collide and crash, we get a disaster. You see, we make treasure by what is treasured by us. And so here's what we're going to be doing in this series as we think about treasure. In a world that treasures a lot of different things, and in a world where sometimes what is treasured by one group collides with what is treasured by another group, we're simply going to ask, what is it that God treasures? What is precious, what is valuable, what is important to God? And if God treasures certain things, the other question that we need to ask ourselves is this: should we treasure these things too? Is what is valuable to God also supposed to be valuable to us? And so today, as we kick off our series, we're going to talk about treasuring other people. Because this is one of the things that God treasures. God treasures people. And so we need to treasure people as well. You know, one of the things that I carry around with me pretty much at all times is my iPhone, because this one little piece of technology pretty much has my whole life on it. I use it to check the weather and check the sports scores and check my email and check my calendar and text people occasionally. I even use it to make a phone call, not very often, but every once in a while I use my phone to call somebody. But I got to tell you, on my phone, when I do make those phone calls, I have a lot of numbers on this phone on my contacts list. I have literally hundreds and hundreds of numbers. But even though I have hundreds and hundreds of numbers in my contact list, I don't contact hundreds and hundreds of people all the time. In fact, there are only a few people that I call all the time. That's why my iPhone has this nifty little feature. I have my big contact list, but then I also have another contact list, and this is a much shorter contact list, and this contact list has on it the people that I call the most. Now, at the top of my contact list, of course, is my wife, Melody. At the top of her contact list, of course, is Brad Pitt, and it's really kind of frustrating. I don't know why she needs to call him all the time. Okay, fine, I just made that up. But it's interesting, on the iPhone, you know what they call this contact list of the people that you call all the time? They call it your favorites list. Isn't that interesting? The iPhone assumes, since these are the people that I call the most, these people must be my favorites. Another way to put it is, these people on my favorites list are the people that I really treasure. Here's what I want to think about as we get into our text for today, okay? According to the Bible, who should be on our list of favorites? According to the Bible, who is it that we should be treasuring the most? Now, this takes us to our text for today, because our text for today is all about treasure, and it's all about treasure in people. Luke 19, our text for today, beginning at verse 1. If you got a Bible from the back of the room, you're going to find it on page 743. Page 743, Luke 19, beginning at verse 1. Jesus entered Jericho, and he was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. I want to pause right there. Our text for today opens with Jesus passing through the city of Jericho. Now, most of the time, when we think of Jericho, we think of the story of Joshua, right? You guys may remember the story. Joshua and the Israelites, they fight this big battle against Jericho. They march around the city for 7 days. On the seventh day, they march around the city 7 times. They blow their horns. They let out a loud shout. And remember what happens to the walls, right? The walls come what? A tumbling down. That's the way the song goes. That's the story that most of us know about Jericho. Now, by the time we get to the first century in Luke 19, the scenario that surrounds Jericho is a little bit different. Because after the walls came tumbling down with Joshua, Jericho essentially turned into a ghost town. There wasn't anybody who lived there, but now, in the first century, it's a major metropolis. And that's because Jericho has been moved a little bit, and it's also been rebuilt by Herod the Great. He was one of the great architects of the ancient world. He rebuilt it, and when he rebuilt it big time. He actually built a palace for himself where he would winter, because Jericho was like 1,000 feet below sea level, and so it would be much warmer in Jericho in the winter than it would be in other parts of Palestine. And you can still go there and see the ruins of this colossal palace, all of the rooms, all of the things that he had in there. He had fountains, he had baths, he had a large swimming pool, he had these huge palm trees. It was a gorgeous place. He also built these amazing aqueducts. You can still see them. They still stand today in the city of Jericho. He built a hippodrome, a stadium where people would go and would watch races. This city was a wonder architecturally. Not only that, the city was also fabulously wealthy. In fact, Jericho was actually one of the richest towns in the ancient world. Jericho was situated about 5 miles west of the Jordan River, and it was actually a border town. You can take a look up here on the screen. There's Jericho. There's the Jordan River. And Jericho was on the border between Perea to the east and Judea to the west. And because it was a border town, because it was between these two areas, there was a lot of commerce that would pass through the city of Jericho. And Jericho was the place where all of this commerce would be taxed as it passed from one country to the next. And so Jericho was a toll city. It made a ton of money off the commerce that passed through the city because it was on a major thoroughfare. And that is why in our text for today, when Jesus is passing through Jericho, who should he meet in Jericho but a man, a tax collector named Zacchaeus. Now, Zacchaeus is a Hebrew name. And in Hebrew, Zacchaeus means pure and righteous. Now, I've got to be honest with you. If you were a first century Jew and you knew a tax collector, you would look at a tax collector as anything but pure and righteous. You need to understand that people back then, they looked at tax collectors a lot differently than people do now. Now, when we see somebody with IRS emblazoned on their uniform, we get giddy. We love tax collectors. We cannot wait to give our money to the government, right? But back then, people were more skeptical of these guys. Rather than being universally respected and adored, tax collectors were despised and hated. In fact, it's interesting. Tax collectors are mentioned all over ancient literature. They're mentioned in Athenian literature. They're mentioned in Egyptian literature. They're mentioned in Roman literature. They're mentioned in Palestinian literature. You want to know how many of these mentions give tax collectors a good name? Not a one of them. Doesn't matter what country you lived in, what time you lived in, what nation you lived in, what area you lived in, tax collectors were looked upon with universal disdain. Now, in Israel, tax collectors were especially despised for a couple of reasons. First reason tax collectors were really despised was because if you were a tax collector for Israel, you were actually a Jew by birth. But you sold out your own people and your own country, and you decided that you were going to go get a job with the government and work collecting taxes for the occupying force in your country, which was Rome. And so if you were a Jew collecting taxes from Jews in the first century to send it up to Rome, you were essentially considered a traitor. You were someone who sold out your own people to turn a buck for the government. The other reason that tax collectors were especially despised in Israel had to do with the way that they collected taxes. Because back in the first century, tax collectors would not just collect a percentage of your income. Rather, the government would give tax collectors a quota that they had to meet, let's say 10,000 denarii. And they would have to bring back that quota to the Roman government no matter what. And they didn't care who they got it from, and they didn't care how they got it. Didn't matter if you were rich or poor, if you had a good year financially or if you had a bad year financially. If they were having a hard time meeting their quota, they were going to do anything and everything they could to get money out of you so they could meet their quota. They'd rough you up, they'd threaten you, they'd cajole you, they'd scare you, they would throw you in jail. They were going to get the money they needed out of you. But it actually went beyond that. Because obviously, if tax collectors, if all they did was collect the quota that they needed to send to the government, how much money did that leave for tax collectors themselves to live on? Nothing. And so tax collectors, what they had to do to make a living was to collect taxes above and beyond the tax quota that they had to send to the government so they themselves could make a living. And it was totally up to them how much they could collect. They could either collect a little bit over their quota and just barely scrape by as a tax collector, or they could collect a lot over their quota and live very comfortably. Now, given the choice to collect a little bit over your quota and just barely scrape by, or collect a lot over your quota and live very comfortably, which one do you think tax collectors are going to take? Option A, barely scrape by. Option B, live very comfortably. They're going to take option B. Of course. That's why tax collectors were hated. They were seen by first century Jews as extortionists. And Zacchaeus was a tax collector. Not only was he a tax collector, he was a chief tax collector. He was high up the IRS totem pole. And notice that Luke makes a special point to say that Zacchaeus was wealthy in verse 2. He says, a man was in Jericho, his name was Zacchaeus, he was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. And so, is Zacchaeus just collecting a little bit over his quota that he needs to send to the Roman government so he can barely scrape by, or is he collecting a lot over his quota? He's collecting a lot. Zacchaeus, he is extorting people so that he can live in the lap of luxury. Zacchaeus was a man who had a ton of treasure. But I'll tell you what, as much treasure as Zacchaeus had, it wasn't quite enough. Zacchaeus wanted something more. Luke 19, verse 3, the story continues. Zacchaeus, here's what he wanted. He wanted to see who Jesus was. But being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Zacchaeus had a ton of treasure, but he wanted something more. Zacchaeus wanted to see somebody. Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus. In fact, more than that, verse 3 says that Zacchaeus wanted to see who Jesus was. Now, this little phrase, who Jesus was, is actually very important because most of the time we just kind of gloss over that phrase. We're already to the part where he's climbing the sycamore tree because he's too short to see above the crowd. And just kind of an aside here, Zacchaeus was really, really short. To be short in that day probably meant that you were less than 5 feet tall. And so Zacchaeus was a little dude. But it's not just that Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus when he climbed the tree, it's that he wanted to see who Jesus was. In other words, he wasn't just trying to catch a glimpse of a celebrity. He wanted to get to know this man. He wanted to understand this man. He wanted to get to know the nature and the character of Christ. He didn't just want to see Jesus. He wanted to see who Jesus was so that he could understand a little bit better what Jesus had come to do. And this is huge. Because one of the calls that we have as Christians is to see who Jesus is. To understand what Jesus has come to do. And in our world, there are a lot of people who believe that you can't really do that. You can't really do what Zacchaeus does. You can't really get to know who Jesus is. For a lot of people, Jesus just kind of remains a mystery. There's a book that's come out recently, a bestseller, #1 by a news commentator named Bill O'Reilly, and it's called Killing Jesus. And I've been asked by a lot of people what I think of it, and it's really good in some parts, but there are some other parts where I kind of take a little bit of pause. Bill actually writes in the introduction to his book, he says this: "Much has been written about Jesus, the son of a humble carpenter, but little's actually known about him. Of course, we have the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, but they sometimes appear contradictory. And were written from a spiritual point of view rather than as a historical chronicling of Jesus' life." And so notice what Bill O'Reilly says here. He says, there's little that we can actually know about Jesus. Unlike Zacchaeus, we can't actually know who Jesus was. Now, I got to tell you, I would beg to differ. You know, Bill O'Reilly actually did an interview with Norah O'Donnell of 60 Minutes. And he talked about some of the things that we cannot know about Jesus, how we cannot really know who Jesus was. And take a look here as to what he said in this interview.
You include 2 quotes from Jesus on the cross, but not the most famous one. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Why not?
We don't put in things that we don't think happened.
How do you know?
Because you couldn't say something like that audibly that people would hear. You die on a cross from being suffocated, that your lungs can't take in any more air. You can hardly breathe. We believe Jesus said that, but we don't believe he said it on the cross because nobody could have heard it.
But Bill, you know what people are going to say. The Bible says that Jesus said on the cross, "Father, forgive them," but Bill O'Reilly says that's not true. So I should believe Bill.
You believe what you want. If you want to take the Bible literally, then that's your right to do that.
But you use as your sources for this book the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but you pick and choose.
Right, but that's not our only source. I mean, we use Muslim sources, we use Roman sources, we use Jewish sources.
So is this the Gospel according to Bill?
This is best available evidence according to Bill. We believe that the oral history in the Bible is largely accurate, but we're not taking it literally.
That's not quite right. We can know who Jesus was. We can know what Jesus did. We can know the kind of death that Jesus died. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Bill O'Reilly makes the argument that Jesus couldn't have said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," because he died of suffocation on the cross. There's really kind of an interesting line in John 19 where the 2 thieves that are crucified on either side of Jesus, the soldiers come around and the soldiers break their legs. You know why? Because the 2 thieves were not dying quickly enough of suffocation. They could still breathe, and so the soldiers would break their legs so they wouldn't be able to push themselves up to catch their breath, and that's why those 2 thieves eventually die. By the time they get to Jesus, remember, they don't break his legs because Jesus is already dead. Now, if the 2 thieves on either side of him were not dying from suffocation, it probably means that Jesus wasn't dying from suffocation yet either. Most scholars think that between the beatings and between carrying his own cross, he actually wound up wounding, bruising his heart, and his heart gave out on him. He died of a ruptured heart. That's what killed Jesus, not suffocation. That's why not only is Jesus able to say, Father, forgive them from the cross, he's also able to ask God why he's been forsaken. He's also able to talk to Mary and to John. He's able to ask for a drink. And he's finally able to cry out in a loud voice, it is finished. You see, we can know who Jesus is because we have this book. Zacchaeus is a man who wants to know who Jesus is. He doesn't just want to see Jesus, he wants to see who Jesus was. And wouldn't you know it, Jesus honors that request. Because here's the great thing about Jesus. When people want to see who Jesus is, Jesus wants them to know. Jesus wants them to see. And Jesus wants them to believe. And so Jesus honors Zacchaeus' request. Luke 19, verse 5, he says, when Jesus reached the spot, he looks up and he speaks to Zacchaeus. He says to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Zacchaeus was trying to figure out who Jesus was, and so he climbs a sycamore tree. And yet it's interesting because as it turns out, even though Zacchaeus isn't quite sure who Jesus is, Jesus knows exactly who Zacchaeus is. He calls out to him in verse 5, Zacchaeus. Now think about this. How many times have Jesus and Zacchaeus met before this point? A grand total of 0 times. And yet Jesus calls Zacchaeus by name. Jesus already knows who Zacchaeus is. You know, the Pharisees of that day considered it the sign of a prophet to be able to know somebody's name without ever having met them before. Jesus knows Zacchaeus' name without ever having met him before. Zacchaeus actually gets a clue as to who Jesus is. This man is a prophet, but oh, he's so much more. Jesus says to Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Question for you, is it generally considered to be polite or impolite to invite yourself over to somebody else's house? Is that polite or impolite? Generally it is impolite. I can remember when I was a kid, my parents had these friends that they got to know when they were first married. And by now, my parents were a little bit older. They had 3 kids they were raising. Their friends were a little bit older. They had 3 kids they were raising. And my parents' friends were taking a vacation across the country. They were coming from the East Coast, where they lived, to the West Coast, where we lived. And they wanted to stop by and see us. In fact, they wanted to stop by and see us for 10 days. And they wanted to stop by and stay in our house. Now, you need to understand that we lived in a 3-bedroom, 1-bath, 1,400 square foot home growing up. It was not a very nice house. I actually went to Google Maps. There's a picture of my childhood home. Not a big place. Now, you put 5 people in there, it was cramped. You put 10 people in there, it was nuts. And to make matters worse, this family kind of treated their stay like they were at like a hotel, a Ramada or something. When they were done with the towel, they'd just throw it on the floor. When they got out of bed, they would leave it unmade. And then they would come out, and the first thing they'd wonder is, where was the breakfast buffet? I mean, come on, what kind of place is this? You know, needless to say, by the end of that 10 days, my parents were frazzled and frenzied and fried. They were ready for their friends to get out of the house. And it's interesting, those friends aren't their friends anymore. I have no idea why. It's not really polite to invite yourself over to somebody else's house. It can be stressful, it can be overwhelming, and it wasn't polite in Jesus' day either. And yet, Jesus invites himself over, and notice how he invites himself over. It's very interesting. In verse 5, he says, I must stay at your house today. Now, this word must is key, because this is kind of a forceful word, don't you think? I mean, usually you at least kind of want to make it sound like you're asking. You want to say, well, I'd really like to stay at your house, or please let me stay at your house. I have nowhere else to go. Jesus doesn't even try to make it sound like he's asking. He just flat out comes out and says, I must stay at your house today. Now, what's going on here is Jesus just kind of being overly dramatic so he can weasel himself into somebody else's home. Actually, what's going on here is something known as a divine imperative. In the Gospels, a divine imperative is a command that comes from God the Father. It's given to God the Son. And you know what word is always used with a divine imperative? The word must. For example, Mark 8, verse 31. Jesus then began to teach his disciples that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Mark 9, verse 12, Jesus says the Son of Man must suffer and be rejected. Luke 4, verse 43, Jesus says, I must preach the good news of the kingdom of God. All over the Gospels, Jesus walks around and he says, I must do this, and I must do that, and I must say this, and I must say that. Well, why must he? Where are the orders coming from? They're coming from God the Father. And so when Jesus goes to Zacchaeus and he says, I must, that's meant to be a cue and a clue for us. Where is Jesus getting the order that he must go to Zacchaeus' house? He's getting it from God the Father. You see, God is the one who's orchestrating this whole meeting. God is the one who is setting up this time between Zacchaeus and Jesus because God knows Zacchaeus' heart's desire. God knows that Zacchaeus wants to see who Jesus is. He wants to understand what Jesus has come to do. And so, Luke 19, verse 6, Zacchaeus came down at once, and he welcomed Jesus gladly. It may break social protocol to invite yourself over. But Zacchaeus doesn't seem put out by this breach of social protocol at all. Quite the contrary, he seems very happy. He seems ecstatic. He welcomes Jesus gladly, the verse says. Quick note on the Greek here. The Greek word for welcomed, when Zacchaeus welcomes Jesus, is the word hypodekomai. It's a two-part word. Dekomai is a verb that means to receive, and then hypo is a preposition that is meant to intensify a verb. And so the idea here is that when Zacchaeus welcomes Jesus, he doesn't just welcome him barely, he like rolls out the red carpet for Jesus. Zacchaeus is real excited about having Jesus at his house. Zacchaeus is real excited about picking Jesus' brain. And so Zacchaeus welcomes him. He welcomes him big time, and he welcomes him gladly. Zacchaeus shows to Jesus hospitality. And I do just want to say that what Zacchaeus does here with Jesus is something that we ought to be doing with everybody. You know, one of the big virtues in the New Testament is this virtue of welcoming. The New Testament calls it hospitality. New Testament says we all ought to be hospitable people. Romans 12, verse 13, practice hospitality. Hebrews 13, verse 2, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without even knowing it. Hospitality, a big deal in the Bible. And here's the reason it's a big deal. When you are hospitable to other people, you know what you're doing, right? You're valuing them. You're treasuring them. You're saying to them, you matter to me. And so I want to show love to you. I want to welcome you. We've probably all had the experience before of wanting to be invited somewhere and then being left out. Could be when you were a kid and a bunch of your friends got invited to a birthday party, but you didn't. Could be when you were in high school and, you so desperately and direly wanted to go to homecoming, but nobody asked you on that date. Could be at your place of work, where you feel left out because you have people who go out on these informal gatherings and you're never invited. If you've ever not been invited to a place even though you really wanted to go, you know the sting of being left out. And that's the beauty of hospitality. Hospitality says you're not left out, you're invited. You're not left out, you're welcomed. You're not left out because you matter. And everybody needs to feel like they matter. Everybody needs to know they're invited. And so Zacchaeus gladly welcomes Jesus. He practices hospitality. But it's interesting because even though Zacchaeus is practicing a thoroughly righteous virtue here when he welcomes Jesus into his house, the people who see this whole exchange take place are not really happy. They're not really happy with Zacchaeus because they still hate his guts, but they're even less happy with Jesus. Because Jesus has just invited himself over to the house of a tax collector. Luke 19, verse 7 says, all the people saw this and they began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. Jesus goes over to Zacchaeus' house and tongues begin to wag. Verse 7 says that people begin to mutter. Greek word for mutter here is the word diaganguzo. And what's important to know about this word diaganguzo is that it is not just a word for muttering in the New Testament. It is actually a word that underlies a lot of stories in the Old Testament. Specifically, when the Israelites are wandering through the wilderness. Exodus 17, verse 3, the people were thirsty for water and they grumbled. The Greek word behind grumbled here is the word diaganguzo. They grumbled, diaganguzoed against Moses. They said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? Numbers 14, verse 2, all the Israelites grumbled. Again, the Greek word behind this is the word diaganguzo. They grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, oh, if only we had died in Egypt or in the desert. And so here are the Israelites, they're wandering around in the ancient wilderness, and they do not understand what the Lord is doing. They do not understand the rescue that God is trying to give them, and so you know what they do? They diaganguzo. They grumble, they mutter, they whine, they complain. 1,400 years later after the Exodus, not much has changed. Here's a group of Jews, and the Lord has gone to rescue a tax collector from his sin, from his self-serving and self-seeking ways. But they don't understand the rescue the Lord is trying to give. And so you know what they do 1,400 years later? They diaganguzo. Just like they did in the Exodus, they do it again with Zacchaeus. This guy has gone to be the guest of a sinner, they say. Now, notice how the NIV puts the word sinner in quotation marks. You need to understand that in the first century, there were really only two categories of people, okay? There were righteous people, and there were sinful people. There were good guys, and there were bad guys. There were the folks who wore the white hat, the folks who wore the dark hat. And here's the way that you told the difference between good guys and bad guys, righteous people and sinners. You told the difference between these two categories of people by the external impression that they made. In other words, you looked at how a person behaved publicly. Were they polite? Did they say what they were supposed to say? Did they do what they were supposed to do? Did they follow Jewish law the way that you thought they were supposed to follow it? Zacchaeus did not do any of that. He was a tax collector. He was a traitor. He worked for the Roman government. He was a cheat. He extorted too much money out of people. He got rich off the backs of poor people. He clearly was not in that righteous category. He was in the sinful category. And it's not just Zacchaeus who was in that sinful category. All tax collectors were in that sinful category. I want to show you a quote from the Mishnah. This is a compendium of ancient Jewish rabbinical teaching, and this is what it says about tax collectors. It says, the tax collectors who enter a house, the house is unclean. The Jews thought that tax collectors were so nasty and so revilable that if you ever welcomed them into your house, your whole house would basically be dirty. It'd be unclean. It'd be full of sin. Because tax collectors were not righteous. Tax collectors were clearly sinful. But it's interesting because Jesus knows something about good guys and bad guys. Jesus knows something about righteous people and sinful people. If you lived in the first century, righteousness was all about the external impression that you made. Did you behave well in public? That's how you could tell the difference between a righteous person and a sinful person. Jesus knows that righteousness goes a lot deeper than that. Jesus knows that righteousness is not just about the external impression that you make. It's about the internal disposition that you have. Jesus knows that you can look real good on the outside and be rotten to the core on the inside. That's why Jesus will say things like in Matthew 23, he'll talk to the Pharisees and the religious leaders and he'll say, woe. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you're hypocrites. You're like whitewashed tombs which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones, dead things, and everything else unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people to be righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Jesus says to the religious leaders, yeah, you guys make a great external impression, but your internal disposition is awful. You may look righteous on the outside, but you're sinful on the inside. You see, in the first century, everybody thought there were two categories of people: righteous people and sinful people, good people and bad people. Jesus comes along, however, and he knows better. Jesus knows, because he can see inside people, that there's only one category of people. And that one category is bad people. That one category is wicked people. That one category is sinful people, because no matter how great we may look on the outside, on the inside, we all got sin going on. That's why the Apostle Paul can write things like in Romans 3, there's no one righteous, not even one. There's no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They've all together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Jesus knows Zacchaeus is a sinner. Jesus knows that Zacchaeus is a bad guy. But Jesus has good news for Zacchaeus, because you see, Jesus has come to save sinners. And that's why when Jesus comes to Zacchaeus' house, there's a radical change in Zacchaeus. Because Jesus does with Zacchaeus what nobody else can do. Jesus saves him, and that salvation changes him. Luke 19, verse 8. Zacchaeus stood up and he said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay back 4 times that amount." You know, the change in Zacchaeus is palpable, isn't it? With just one visit, Zacchaeus goes from being really greedy to really generous. I mean, the shift is almost instantaneous. He says in verse 8, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'm going to pay back 4 times that amount." You know, I love the NIV translation here where Zacchaeus says here and now, because it captures the spirit of Zacchaeus' heart just beautifully. Zacchaeus, when he's going to be generous, he's not going to be generous in the future. Zacchaeus doesn't say, "Hey, look, I will give half my possessions to the poor." He says, "No, I am giving half of my possessions to the poor here and now." It's not that I will pay back 4 times over anything that I've cheated anybody out of. It's that I am paying back 4 times over anything that I've cheated anybody out of here and now. Zacchaeus' life is changing here and now. And make no mistake about it, this change is monumental. In fact, it would have been shocking to anybody who saw this scenario. Zacchaeus says, you know, my change is so radical that I'm going to give away 50% of my stuff. I'm going to give away half of my possessions to the poor. You know, Jewish tradition said that if you wanted to be really, 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 really super extra generous, I mean, go way above and beyond the call of duty, you could give away 20% of your possessions. But the rabbis actually taught that if you gave away more than 20% of your possessions, you were a fool. Because if you give away more than 20% of your possessions, that means that you would be poor, and it doesn't do any good to help poor people while making yourself poor. I want to show you a quote from the Talmud, another ancient compendium of Jewish wisdom. It says, if a man desires to spend liberally, and the idea here is spending liberally and giving liberally, he should not spend more than 1/5. Do the math, that's 20%. Since by spending more, he might himself come to be in need of the help of other people. Jewish rabbis said, if you give away more than 20% of your stuff, you're going to go to the poorhouse yourself, and that's foolish. But Zacchaeus, he didn't listen to the rabbis. He just gives away half of his stuff. He gives over twice the amount that he ought to be giving away according to basic Jewish financial wisdom. Financial planners would have been going nuts with Zacchaeus. His nest egg just evaporates like that. But that's not all. Zacchaeus says in verse 8, "Here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and, by the way, if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'm going to pay back 4 times the amount." Now, that's quite a recompense, don't you think? Jewish law did indeed provide for restitution if you had been cheated out of something. And there was actually a time when you would have to pay back 4 times the amount that which you stole. But it was only if you happened to steal an oxen or a sheep, if there was a sufficient number of witnesses, eyewitnesses to your theft, and if you killed the oxen or sheep and you sold the oxen or sheep at market for a profit. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to pay back 4 times that amount. Zacchaeus, he would have just had to pay back 1 time the amount. He would have had to give back what he stole. But what Zacchaeus does is he takes the steepest of penalties in a worst-case scenario and he applies it to everything he's taken. Everything he's taxed. Because you see, when Zacchaeus gives 4 times the amounts of stuff that he's taken from other people back to those people, Zacchaeus doesn't really see that as a penalty. He sees it as an opportunity to be generous. He sees it as an opportunity to treasure people. The story of Zacchaeus is a story of a man who has his treasure shifted from one place to another place. At the beginning of Zacchaeus' story, it's real clear what his treasure is. His treasure is money. His treasure is being rich. His treasure is living the high life. But by the end of the story, Zacchaeus' treasure has shifted from that to people. Rather than helping himself to everybody else's money, Zacchaeus wants to help others by being generous. Now, of course, this kind of begs the question, why? Why, and really how? How is it that such a monumental shift could take place in a man so quickly? How did it happen? Here's how it happened. When everybody else hated Zacchaeus, one person treasured Zacchaeus. When everybody else despised Zacchaeus, one person talked to Zacchaeus. When everybody else rejected Zacchaeus, one person visited Zacchaeus. And the good news is that one person's name is Jesus. Jesus finally says, Luke 19, verse 9, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost." When everybody else called Zacchaeus a traitor, Jesus calls Zacchaeus a son. You know why? Because Jesus treasures people. You want to know what's treasured by the Son of God? You are. That's why Jesus came for you. That's why Jesus lived for you. That's why Jesus taught for you. That's why Jesus died for you. That's why Jesus rose for you. And that's why Jesus promises you salvation. It's because you are Jesus's treasure. And I'll tell you what, Jesus's treasure should be your treasure too. You know, I was thinking about this. There's so many things that Jesus does in the Gospels that there's just no way we could ever hope to do, right? Jesus miraculously heals people. We can't pull that off. Jesus drives out demons. That's a rough one. Jesus feeds large crowds with just meager scraps of bread and some fish. Can't pull that off either. Jesus can still storms with just a word. Nobody can do that. Jesus can die for the sins of the world. That's only Jesus, not you or me. Jesus can rise from death 3 days later. That's something we can't do either. And Jesus can conquer sin and death and the devil. There's no way that we can do that. That's why Jesus is the Savior and we are not. Because Jesus does all the stuff that we cannot do for ourselves. And yet it's interesting because we'll be reading through the Bible and Paul will say something like Ephesians 5 verse 1, be imitators of God. Now how does that work? Jesus does all of these things that there is no way that we could ever hope to do. How can we imitate Jesus? How can we imitate God? Well, Paul actually explains how as he continues. Because Paul is not talking about imitating Jesus by saving people, by dying for people, by doing miracles for people. He's not talking about that. He's talking about imitating God in a very specific way. He says, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children. And here's how we imitate. Here's how we imitate the Lord. We live a life of love. In other words, we treasure people the way that Jesus treasures us. That's why Jesus says, John 13, verse 35, by this all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another, if you treasure one another. Jesus treasures us. You are called to imitate Jesus and treasure others. And so let me ask you just real two simple questions. The first one is, who? Who can you treasure? Because there are people who need to be treasured by you. Could be a coworker, could be a neighbor, could be that awkward kid in the class. Second question then is how? How can you treasure them? Sometimes treasuring people doesn't take a lot of effort. It just takes love. You invite them over to your house to share a meal with you. You spend 10 minutes just to get to know them a little bit better. You offer to pray for them. You remember hallmark events in their lives and you send them a card. You show them some grace. You know, when someone is treasured by somebody else, that can change a life. Just take it from Zacchaeus. You know, I've talked to you before about my dog, Bandit. Bandit became a member of our family a couple of years ago. Somebody up in Stone Oak was driving on 410 one day, and they saw this little Shih Tzu running along the side of the road. And that person pulled over, picked up this little black and white Shih Tzu, and that person gave him to another person who was going to watch him for a little while, and that person gave him to another person who was going to watch him for a little while, and that person just happened to be friends with my wife, Melody. And so that person called Melody and asked if she'd be interested in having a dog. Now, here was the key. It wasn't just a dog, it was a free dog. Free dogs are good dogs, right? Melody sees a picture of the dog and she falls in love with this little black and white Shih Tzu. And so she comes to me and she says to me, Zach, are you interested in a dog? And I got to be honest, I was a little skeptical. First question I asked was, they found this dog where? Running on the side of 410? You've got to be kidding me. So Melody made a deal with me. She said, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll try him. One night. 370 nights later, we're still trying him. And by now, he's part of the family. And I got to say, I have grown to love Bandit. You know, Bandit has been great. There was this time, however, a couple of months after we got him, where Bandit got sick. In fact, he got very sick. So sick, in fact, that in the middle of the night, I had to take him to the doggy ER. I didn't even know that doggy ERs existed before that night, but they do exist. I had to take him to the doggy ER. They ran a bunch of tests on this little dog, and you know what they found out? They found out that he had a hepatic shunt. And basically that means that he cannot process protein. That's a problem, because you know what dog food has a lot of? It has a lot of protein. Protein was like poison to his system. And so they said, we're going to have to pull all the protein out of his diet. And so Melody bought these sweet potatoes and all of this rice, started mashing it all up together, and would feed it to the dog because he couldn't eat dog food. And the docs finally said, okay, there's only one way to fix the dog. The one way is surgery. We got to go in there and we got to get the shunts. Now, you need to know something about surgery, okay? Surgery ain't cheap. You know how much I treasure Bandit? About $2,500 worth. That's how much I treasure Bandit. And I've decided that the next time we get a dog, I'll just pay the money on the front end rather than paying the $2,500 on the back end. No more free dogs. But I've got to say, Bandit was worth every penny. You know why I think Bandit is worth every penny? First of all, he is a great dog. But here's the other reason he's worth every penny. I cannot replace a moment like that. There's my dog, and there's my girl. And every time I look at that picture, my heart just gets full. You know, Jesus says, Matthew 6, verse 21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What you treasure, what you think about, what you dream about, what you spend your time on, what you work toward, what you strive for. That's the kind of stuff that's going to fill your heart. Now, this world would say, you know, money can fill your heart, power can fill your heart, fame can fill your heart, lust can fill your heart, greed can fill your heart, pride can fill your heart. Jesus says, how about we make it people who fill your heart? How about it's people that we treasure? How about it's people that we love? You know, what Jesus desires is simply this. He desires that because you fill his heart, by his Spirit, he would fill yours. Because when he fills yours, what matters to him matters to you. And when he fills your heart, he takes your heart and the rest of you as well and leads you to a filled life in eternity. And that, my friends, is a tremendous treasure. Let's stand and pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the great treasure of your Son, Jesus Christ. Father, by your Spirit, may we take seriously the call that you give to us to treasure each other, to treasure people just as you treasure us so much that you send your Son to die for us. Heavenly Father, we thank you for Zacchaeus. We thank you for the love that you showed to him through your Son, Jesus. Now may we imitate you in the love that we show for others. We ask this by the power of your Spirit and in the name of your Son. Amen. Have a great week, guys. Walk with light.